They come every year, without fail. Every New Year's Eve, midnight strikes, and someone dies. But this isn't a regular death. No, it's far worse. I'm not telling you this to scare you. I'm telling you this because tonight, you'll understand why it's happening, why it always happens. It begins with the invitation, a simple letter. Nothing special about it, just an envelope that shows up in your mailbox when you least expect it. But what's inside? What's inside is enough to make your blood freeze. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter how old you are. When the invitation arrives, you are already dead. No one survives the invitation. Not even me. The first time it happened, I thought it was a joke. A twisted joke. Then, the phone call came. The first victim. A woman in her late 30s. She didn't scream, didn't cry. No, she just vanished. Gone. No trace. Her neighbors said the lights flickered, the clock struck 12, and she was never seen again. The only thing they found? That letter. You're probably thinking, this is insane. It's just a coincidence. It's not. It's never been a coincidence. Every year, it's the same. The letter arrives, midnight strikes, someone dies. 2 years ago, it was a child, a little girl. I didn't know her name. I didn't need to. She opened the letter like they all got curious, excited. Like the others, she went to bed, and at midnight, she was gone. Her body was found in her room, her eyes wide open, frozen in terror. But I didn't realize. I didn't understand. I thought it was just a series of strange deaths. Until I got my letter. It's too late for me. I know it's too late. You don't get an invitation and walk away. You can't. It takes you. It changes you. I thought I could fight it. I thought I could run. But here's the thing nobody ever tells you. When the clock strikes 12, they're already watching. And now, the only thing I'm waiting for is midnight. I'm already marked. And so are you. Tick, tock. You have no idea what's coming next. I knew something was wrong the minute I saw him. Detective James Carter. They called him the best, but I never believed that. Not after seeing what was left behind. He was the one they sent every year to investigate, even though everyone knew there was no solving this. The town had tried. The police had tried. But there was no pattern, no suspect, no explanation. Just a string of deaths. Each one more horrific than the last. This year, as usual, Detective Carter sat at his desk, flipping through the same old files. The files that never changed. The files that for 3 years had led to nothing. He lit a cigarette and looked out the window as the clock in the corner of his office ticked, its rhythm steady and mocking. The way he smoked, slowly, methodically, was like he was trying to bury himself in the hazarding to shut out the truth. But there was no escaping it. The truth was staring him in the face. Every year, at midnight, someone dies. It's always someone new. But for Carter, this year felt different. You could see it in his eyes. The weariness, the resignation, like a man who had given up hope. The phone rang. He picked it up. The same bored expression on his face, as though he already knew what was coming. Another one. The voice on the other end of the line said, but Carter didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Same time, same place. Another body. He was already on his feet, grabbing his coat, lighting another cigarette. I could almost hear his mind working as he stepped out into the night, as though the knowledge that death was imminent had already sunk in. He'd seen it all before. He'd felt it all before. But tonight, it was different. Tonight, he had a feeling that this time, the curse would finally come for him too. Carter pulled up to the scene, his car screeching to a halt in front of a small house just on the edge of town. The lights were on, the door slightly ajar. He stepped inside without knocking, like he was already expecting to find something that made sense. But he wasn't going to find that. None of us ever would. The house was eerily quiet, like death had already claimed it. And there, on the floor, lay the body of a man older than 35. His eyes were wide open, staring at something only he could see. His mouth was frozen in a scream, but no sound came out. His body wasn't just dead, it was marked. Like the others, his skin had been drained of color, leaving a ghostly pallor. There was no blood, no wounds, no sign of struggle. Just gone. Detective Carter knelt by the body, his face grim. But this time, something was different. Something had shifted in the air, like the silence was too heavy, too thick to breathe. He looked up at the room's corner and saw etched into the wall, with what looked like soot or ash, a symbol. The same symbol that had appeared at every other crime scene. A symbol no one could explain. It was the mark of the Whisperer. He didn't need to say a word. He didn't need to ask. He already knew what had happened. "It's happening again," Carter muttered to himself, his voice barely audible. His hands trembled for the first time in years as he reached for his phone to call for backup. But when the phone rang in his hand, the line was dead, and then the lights flickered. Carter's eyes darted around the room as if something were lurking, something just out of sight. The symbol on the wall glowed faintly, like it was alive. And then he heard it, the faintest whisper, almost too quiet to catch. "You should have stayed away." The voice echoed in his mind, sending chills down his spine. Carter slammed the phone shut, his heartbeat quickening. The thing about Detective Carter was that he didn't believe in curses. He didn't believe in ghosts or anything that couldn't be explained with logic. But there was something about tonight. The air was thick with tension, the smell of death overwhelming, and in the pit of his stomach, he knew. This wasn't just another murder. This wasn't just another victim. This time, it was personal. Before we dive deeper into the chilling twist of tonight's story, I want to hear from you. What would you do if you were in Carter's shoes? Would you confront the Whisperer head on, or would you run for your life? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this spine-tingling tale, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more terrifying horror stories and mind-bending crime mysteries. You never know what's lurking in the next video, so hit that notification bell to stay one step ahead of the darkness. Detective Carter was never the kind of man who believed in the supernatural. To him, everything had a logical explanation, a reason, a cause. But that night, as he stood in the middle of that quiet room, staring at the body and the strange symbol on the wall, I knew we could feel it. The air was heavy with something unexplainable, and it was beginning to weigh on him. I could feel it too, but for a different reason. He was getting too close to the truth. Carter spent the next few days retracing the steps of every victim from the past 3 years. The same methodical routine. Visit the crime scene, interview the neighbors, check for signs of a struggle. But there were never any signs, just the bodies, just the marks. He started asking questions no one had dared to ask before. Questions that pushed the limits of what the townspeople were willing to talk about. Rumors had started circulating, whispers of a curse that had haunted this town for generations. Carter didn't buy it. He couldn't. It was far too insane, even for him. But there was one thing that kept bugging him. The letters. Every victim had received the invitation. A strange letter with no return address, delivered days before the killings. It was at the old library where Carter first found something that made him pause. A dusty, leather-bound book tucked away in the back of the shelf, hidden under layers of forgotten history. The title was simple, almost too simple. The Whisperer's Curse, a local legend. Carter's fingers trembled as he opened it. Not from fear, but from something else's something he couldn't place. He read through the pages, his brow furrowing deeper with each paragraph. It was all there, written in ancient script, stories of a dark entity known as the Whisperer, an evil force that only struck on New Year's Eve, marking the chosen with a letter, dragging them into darkness. It was as if the book was describing the exact events happening now, like the past was repeating itself. "It can't be real," Carter muttered to himself. But even as he spoke the words, the air in the room seemed to grow colder, and the faintest whisper brushed against his ear. "You should have stopped looking." He slammed the book shut, his heart racing. But it wasn't enough. Something was pulling him in, dragging him deeper into a darkness he couldn't escape. The book had opened a door. Now, there was no going back. The next night, Carter stood in front of the last victim's house. He was there, alone, watching the windows, waiting for anything. The clock struck midnight, and that's when the first thing happened that truly made Carter's blood run cold. The wind shifted, carrying a soft whisper that was barely audible, yet unmistakable. Carter turned around, but no one was there. His heart pounded as he glanced at the windows dark, still. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, that feeling of being watched. He was no longer investigating. He was being hunted. Suddenly, a light flickered in one of the upstairs windows. Carter's hand instinctively went to his gun, but before he could even move, the lights went out completely. Total darkness. Then the scream. It was a woman's voice, sharp and piercing, filled with fear. Carter's eyes went wide, his breath catching in his throat. The scream came again, and then it stopped as suddenly as it had begun. There was no time to think, only to act. He rushed inside, the door creaking open with a violent push. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that wrapped around you like a suffocating blanket. He moved cautiously, step by step, his flashlight casting shadows that seemed to twist and writhe. The air was thick, and the smell it was metallic, like blood, but sweeter, almost intoxicating. He reached the staircase. The door to the second floor was ajar. He stepped inside, his flashlight sweeping across the walls, and that's when he saw it, the mark again. The same symbol, drawn in red this time, smeared across the doorframe. But this wasn't just a mark, it was a message. As Carter stepped closer, the temperature dropped so suddenly he could see his breath. The whispering returned, louder now, filling his ears like a swarm of bees. The words, barely audible, sliced through the silence. "You shouldn't have come, Carter. You should have stayed away." And then he saw Ita's shadow in the corner of the room, something moving, but not quite. A shape that was human, yet not. It flickered in and out of focus, like it was glitching, shifting between the physical world and something darker. Carter froze, his heart thudding in his chest. He raised his flashlight, his hands shaking. It was gone. But the whispering didn't stop, and the shadows, they were closing in. Every night, Carter sat at his desk, poring over the same evidence. The files, the photographs, the police reports, nothing was making sense. It was as if every lead was designed to take him in circles, drawing him deeper into a labyrinth where there was no escape. The more he investigated, the more the evidence seemed to blur the line between the natural and the supernatural. But Carter wasn't a man who believed in things he couldn't see. He'd always prided himself on being pragmatic, but even he couldn't ignore the truth that was staring him in the face now. The pattern was undeniable. Each death, no matter how different the victim, had a common thread. It wasn't just the invitation, the cursed letter. It wasn't just the symbol left behind. It wasn't even the eerie whispers that filled the air during the investigation. It was something much worse. Something far more sinister. The deaths always happened on New Year's Eve. The clock struck midnight, and in that instant, someone close to the victim was marked. Carter had to understand it. He had to find the key that tied all of this together. He spread the photos across his desk, eyes scanning over the details, the faces frozen in fear. He flipped through the reports again, pausing at the sections that stood out, the ones that made no sense. Victim after victim, the same strange circumstances followed. No signs of forced entry, no weapons, no real motive, just death. But then he noticed it. A detail that had slipped past him before. Each victim had a connection to a tragedy, a dark past, a moment in their life that they couldn't escape. Maybe they had been involved in something. Maybe they had done something they shouldn't have. The first victim, Samantha Gray, had been a nurse at a local hospital, and there were rumors of her involvement in a medical malpractice case years ago. The second victim, Ryan Adams, had a history of violent crime. And the third, Charlotte Walker, had suffered a terrible loss of her child, a daughter who had died under mysterious circumstances. Every victim had a dark past. Every one of them had a secret. But what did it mean? What was the connection between the deaths, the symbol, the whispers? What was the curse? As Carter ran his fingers over the photographs, something struck him, as if a light had flickered on in his mind. He didn't want to believe it, but he couldn't ignore it. The deaths were tied to something ancient, something old, something that had been buried in the town's history for centuries. The town had been built over a grave, he realized. A grave that held more than just bones. It held a promise. A promise that when the clock struck midnight on New Year's Eve, someone would pay the price for sins long forgotten, sins that had never been atoned for. There was no stopping it. Carter slammed his fist onto the desk, the shock echoing through the room. But the realization was already setting in. The pattern wasn't just about the victims. It was about the cycle. The curse that had been passed down through generations. It didn't matter what they had done in life. It didn't matter who they were. The curse wasn't about punishment. It was about something darker, something that wanted to make sure the town would never be free. Something that would never stop, no matter how much blood was spilled. But who or what was behind it all? Carter stared at the wall of photos, the faces staring back at him, and that's when he saw it. A new photo, one he didn't remember putting there. It was a picture of him, his own face, looking right at the camera. His stomach lurched as the room seemed to close in on him. His hand trembled as he reached to grab the photo, and that's when he saw the words written in dark ink, smeared across the bottom. "You should have stayed away. Midnight is yours." The Whisperer had found him. No longer just an investigator. He was now a part of the pattern, a part of the cycle. The curse had marked him, and it wasn't going to let him go. Carter slammed the photo down onto the desk, his breath coming in short, frantic gasps. He had crossed a line, and now it was too late. He reached for his phone, dialing the number of his superior. But before the call could go through, the lights flickered. The room went cold, and the whispering started again, louder this time. "You shouldn't have looked." His breath caught in his throat as he turned, his heart racing. The walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, the darkness pushing in from all sides. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw the shadow. It wasn't just a shadow, it was a figure. Tall, almost impossibly tall, with long, spindly limbs that bent in unnatural ways. It moved toward him slowly, its form shifting in and out of focus. And then the whisper came again, this time so close it almost sounded like it was inside his head. "You're next." The figure reached out to him, its fingers long and skeletal, each one ending in sharp, claw-like tips. Carter's breath caught in his throat. He tried to move, to scream, but his body was frozen. The figure's cold, dead eyes locked with his, and Carter knew in that moment that there was no escape. This was it. The curse was real, and it was coming for him. It didn't take long for Carter to realize that the game had changed. The moment he saw that photo of himself, he knew it was too late. It wasn't just the investigation anymore. The curse, the Whisperer, had claimed him. And now, the town's grim history wasn't something he could just study from a distance. It was his history now, his fate. The night after the photo arrived, Carter tried to act as if everything was fine. He tried to go on as if nothing had changed, but deep down, he knew it was only a matter of time before the whispers came for him again. The feeling of being watched never left him. It clung to him like a shadow that stretched and twisted, following him wherever he went. Every corner of his house felt too small, too suffocating. The silence was louder than ever, pressing in on him, and the darkness seemed to come alive when the lights went out. He tried to reach out for help, but the people around him, his colleagues, the townspeople, looked at him like he was crazy. No one would believe him. No one could. How could he explain to them that he was being hunted by something that didn't exist in their world? How could he tell them that every second felt like it could be his last? That night, he did what he could only do. He prepared. He tried to make sure every door was locked, every window sealed. He barricaded himself in his house, certain that if he could just survive until morning, he would be okay. He didn't even sleep. His eyes were wide open, scanning the shadows, listening for the slightest sound. But when midnight struck, everything changed. The clock in his living room ticked louder, each second echoing like the pounding of his own heartbeat. He couldn't breathe. His throat was dry, his chest tight. He could feel the presence in the room with He-Man oppressive weight that made the air thick, suffocating. The whispering began again, faint at first, like a murmur in the distance. But it was getting closer, getting louder. Then it stopped, and the lights flickered. Carter's pulse raced as the room plunged into darkness. He scrambled for his flashlight, his hands trembling. His breath was shallow, and every inch of his skin seemed to crawl with fear. He fumbled with the flashlight until it finally clicked on, its weak beam casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. For a moment, all was still. And then the door opened. At first, Carter thought it was the wind, that maybe he hadn't locked the door properly. But the door had opened too quietly. There was no creak, no groan of the hinges. just the soft, almost imperceptible sound of it, moving on its own. His eyes locked onto the dark shape in the doorway, and that's when he saw it, the figure that had haunted him in his mind, the one he had seen in the corner of his vision, flickering in and out of focus. But now, it wasn't a blur. It was real. It was standing right there. The creature was talon-naturally tall, with limbs that were too long, too thin. Its fingers were like elongated claws, reaching toward him with a slow, deliberate pace. Its face was obscured by a hood, but the eyes were what drew Carter in. They glowed faintly, like dying embers, bright and filled with an ancient malice. The whispering came again, louder now, not in his ears but in his mind. "You've come too far, Carter. You've seen too much." Carter didn't move. He couldn't. He was paralyzed with fear, his legs frozen beneath him. The creature tilted its head slightly, as if studying him, its eyes narrowing in what felt like amusement. It wasn't in a hurry. It wasn't in any kind of rush. It had all the time in the world. Carter found his voice. "Who are you?" The creature didn't respond with words, but the pressure in the room grew unbearable. The temperature dropped, and Carter's breath formed icy clouds in front of him. His hands began to shake uncontrollably. The whispers no. The voices sounded like it was coming from all around him now. "The time is almost here, Carter. You're marked. You belong to the curse now." It stepped forward, its long fingers reaching out, grazing the edge of his shirt. The touch was cold. Too cold. Carter stumbled back, gasping for air, but the creature was right behind him now, its presence crushing him. It whispered in his ear, each word a jagged knife. "No one escapes. Not this time." With a sudden jolt of desperation, Carter reached for his gun. He pulled it from its holster, pointing it at the figure. But his hand was shaking too violently. He couldn't get a steady shot. The figure leaned closer, its breath a cold wind on his skin. And then the lights went out completely. The sound of his heartbeat drowned out everything else. The whispering stopped. And in the silence, Carter heard the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps right behind him. He turned around, his gun raised, but it was too late. The room felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in on him, like the darkness itself was alive. The creature was gone, but Carter could feel the weight of its presence, lingering in the air. He dropped to his knees, his hand shaking as he gripped his gun. His mind raced. Was he losing it? Was he imagining things? Or was this really happening? There was only one thing he knew for certain. The whisperer was real, and it had come for him. From that moment on, Carter's life became a fight for survival. He couldn't trust anyone. He couldn't even trust his own mind. The whispers never stopped, always there, just beyond his hearing, growing louder every night. It was the sound of his doom, a reminder that he was marked. It was only a matter of time. But Carter wasn't ready to die yet. And so, he did what he always did. He fought. He didn't know how to defeat the curse, but he knew one thing: he wasn't going to just roll over and let it take him without a fight. The clock was ticking, and the whisperer was waiting. Carter knew that the end was inevitable. The whispers had grown louder each night, filling his every waking moment with terror. Every time the clock ticked past midnight, he felt the presence grow closer. It wasn't just a haunting anymore. It was a countdown to the moment when his life would be claimed by the curse that had already taken so many others. And now, he understood that there was no escaping it, no running from it. It wasn't just a force of nature. It was a force of will, and it was coming for him. But Carter wasn't ready to give up. He couldn't. As much as he feared the thing that haunted him, he knew there was one last thing he could do. He had to face it head on. There were no more clues to chase, no more leads to follow. The town's history, the symbol, the cursed letter sit, all led to this final moment. The whisperer had already marked him, and now it was time to meet his fate. The night was thick with an unnatural silence, the air heavy with dread. Carter stood alone in the center of his apartment, every light dimmed, every shadow stretching long and distorted across the floor. He wasn't sure what had driven him to this point. Was it desperation? Madness? Or was it the last thread of his sanity that told him this was his only chance? Then it came. A sound soft, almost imperceptible at first, the whispering. faint, like a distant hum, but then it grew, like a rising storm, swirling around him. "It's time, Carter. You can't run. You can't hide." The lights flickered, casting a strobe-like effect on the room. The temperature dropped. Carter felt his breath form in front of him, the icy chill biting into his skin. His heart pounded in his chest, but his feet didn't move. He was locked in place, frozen by the presence that filled the room. It wasn't just in the room, it was in him. Then, through the darkness, he saw it. The figure. The same tall, skeletal figure he had seen before. But now, it was different. It was more solid, more real. Its face was no longer hidden beneath the hood. It was fully revealed, and Carter's stomach twisted at the sight. The face wasn't human. It was something else. Twisted, grotesque, its skin stretched too tight, its eyes glowing with an ancient fury. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged, blackened teeth that seemed to grind together in anticipation. And as it spoke, its voice was like 1,000 voices overlapping, all whispering the same terrible truth. "You are the final piece, Carter. The last sacrifice." Carter's hand shot out, grabbing the gun he had placed on the counter earlier. His fingers were numb, but he gripped it tightly. He didn't know if it would help, but it was the only weapon he had. He aimed it at the creature, his voice barely a whisper. "What do you want from me?" The creature didn't respond. It simply took a step forward, its long fingers extending toward him. As it moved, the air seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, and Carter felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over him. His mind screamed for him to run, but his body wouldn't respond. He was frozen, trapped in the cold, suffocating grasp of the curse. And then, in that moment, he realized the truth. There was no escape. This was never about surviving, it was about atonement. The creature wasn't just here for him. It was here because of the town's sins, because of the evil that had been buried and forgotten. The curse was eternal, and Carter was just another link in the chain. The creature stopped, just inches from him. Its eyes, those glowing, soulless eyes, locked onto his, and for the first time, Carter felt a true sense of nothingness. No life, no hope, just an infinite darkness that consumed everything. And then, as if in response to his terror, the creature spoke again, its voice sending a chill down Carter's spine. "The clock has struck. Midnight has come. You belong to us now." Carter's finger tightened on the trigger. He fired. The sound of the shot echoed through the room, deafening. But it wasn't enough. The creature didn't flinch, didn't move. The bullet passed through it, like it wasn't even there. Carter's heart sank as he realized that his gun was useless. Nothing could stop it. The creature reached out, its cold fingers wrapping around his wrist, tightening with inhuman strength. Carter screamed, but the sound was strangled, lost in the suffocating grip of the thing that held him. His vision blurred, and the world seemed to spin around him. In that moment, he understood. The creature was not just a manifestation of the curse. It was the curse. It had always been there, waiting, watching, feeding on the town's sins. And now, it was feeding on his fear. Carter had become part of the cycle. There was no escape, no way out. The last thing he saw before the darkness closed in was the creature's twisted grin. It wasn't a victory, not really. It was the inevitable end of a never-ending cycle. It would take him, but it would also take the next person, and the next, and the next, because the curse had no end. As Carter's world faded to black, the whispering grew louder, filling his mind with the final terrible truth. "You are nothing. You never were. This is your fate, and it will never be over." And then there was silence. The darkness closed in, but Carter wasn't gone, at least, not yet. His last moments of consciousness were filled with the sharp bite of fear and the crushing weight of inevitability. The curse had claimed him, and as the whisperer's cold grip tightened around his wrist, he knew that death wasn't the end. The creature wasn't simply a being. It was the embodiment of a curse that had lingered far longer than anyone could comprehend, a force that was eternal and merciless. It was over. But was it? In the brief moment before everything fell silent, before the shadows swallowed him whole, something shifted. A sudden flash of realization pierced through the fog of fear clouding Carter's mind. For the briefest instant, he felt something unfamiliar. A sense of familiarity. The photo. It was that damn photo again, the one he had received weeks ago, the one that had started this whole nightmare. In that instant, Carter's mind grasped at the threads of the mystery he had spent so long unraveling. It wasn't just the photo that marked him. No, it was something deeper. Something more personal. And then the twist hit him like a freight train. His breath caught in his throat. Carter realized the Whisperer wasn't here just for him. No, he wasn't the target that had been the bait. The creature had never come for him specifically. It had come for the people around him, for the town, for everyone he had been investigating. The moment the truth hit him, he felt the pressure on his wrist ease. The creature's grip loosened as it stepped back, vanishing like a wisp of smoke, leaving Carter kneeling, shaking, drenched in cold sweat. He wasn't sure what was happening, but a strange pull, a sort of magnetic force, drew him to the center of the room, where something had caught his eye. There, at the edge of the dim light, was a small, hidden corner that he had never noticed before, a corner of his apartment he never paid attention to. He stumbled toward it, his legs unsteady beneath him, but the compulsion was undeniable. He reached the space where the shadows gathered most thickly and found what he wasn't expecting. A mirror. But not just any mirror. This one was different. This was not just a reflection, it was alive. The surface shimmered unnaturally, twisting like liquid. It wasn't a simple mirror. It was a portal. A doorway to another place. The Whisperer's realm. Carter's heart pounded as he reached for it, drawn to it as if it were calling his name. He didn't understand why or how, but in that instant, something deep inside him knew what he had to do. He had to finish what he started. He had to uncover the truth. There could be no escaping the curse unless he faced it head on. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed the surface of the mirror. The moment his skin touched the glass, the world around him shattered and he was pulled into the reflection. For a moment, there was nothing, just blackness, total and unrelenting. Carter's mind screamed in confusion, but then he was somewhere else. A different place, a different time. He stood in the same town, but it was different. The streets were older, weathered, and darker. The buildings were covered in ivy and grime, as though the place had been forgotten by time itself. It was the same town, but now it felt wrong, distorted, like a nightmare made real. Carter looked around, his heart pounding in his chest. In the distance, he saw a figure standing at the edge of a decaying church. It was the same figure, the Whisperer, but now it was not just the creature from his nightmares. It was something more. It was the original entity, the one that had started the curse in the first place. The town's sins, the murders, the disappearances, the darkness buried beneath every stone had given rise to the creature. And it was no accident that Carter had been drawn here. No coincidence. The Whisperer wasn't just a being, it was a manifestation of the town's guilt. The photo, the symbols, the murder, all of it was connected. Carter had been unknowingly following the path of a curse that had existed long before him. His investigation hadn't led him to answers, it had led him to this place, this twisted reality where the past and present collided, where the curse would claim its final victim. Carter tried to move, but his body wouldn't obey him. He was frozen, locked in place by the force of the curse. The Whisperer stepped forward, its eyes glowing with malice, its voice low and mocking. "You were never meant to find the truth, Carter. You were always meant to be part of it." The truth was terrifying. The curse wasn't just tied to the town. It was tied to Carter. He was the final link in a chain that stretched back generations. He had become part of the town's blood-soaked history the moment he started investigating. And now he couldn't escape. In a final desperate attempt to break free, Carter tried to speak, to call out for help, but the words wouldn't come. They were suffocated by the curse, trapped inside him as the creature's grip tightened around his soul. And then, with a sudden sickening realization, Carter understood. The real horror was not the creature. The real horror was the truth behind it. The curse never ends. It's never finished. It always finds someone to carry on the suffering. It feeds on guilt, on fear, on the darkest parts of the human soul. And now, Carter would become the next piece of that never-ending cycle. As his vision blurred and his body began to crumble, he could only hear one thing, the whisper of the curse, echoing through time and space, always calling, always waiting. It's never over. And then, the world went dark.